All right, I'm going to get started. If you want to take a seat in the back, or if you want to continue your conversation, maybe you take it outside. Guys in the back. All right. Maybe if you want to take your conversations outside, I think it would be better.
So use this as well, like all three microphones together. That's what Alaska was doing. The speaker as well.
Do you think it's?
I think it's loud.
Okay. How's that? Sounds any better? Okay, so today I'm going to talk about DAO governance, governance mechanisms, and the path to systemic change of all of the systems that projects within crypto, but even outside of crypto, are focused on changing, really. So my name's Cassidy Daly. I work at a project called Centrifuge. And we have a DAO, and that's sort of the lens that I'm coming to this with. But also having been in the space for a while and looking at a lot of other projects in the space, I want to dive into a few different examples today across a wide range of different domains and how each of them look to DAO governance mechanisms to actually create the change in these systems that they care about. So just a few of the projects that I want to cover today. Obviously, I'll talk about my project Centrifuge. But I also want to look at Vita DAO. This is a DAO to fund longevity research. AAVE, probably all of you know. Financial infrastructure as public goods is what they're focused on. And Radical is a project focused on open source code collaboration. So going through domains of DeFi, open source code collaborations, and DeSci, or decentralized science, that's what things like Vita DAO are working on. And showing that there is really a thread that ties together all of these different organizations, that their goals and beliefs, they're aligned. Even though they're across a wide range of focus areas, they each are trying to create systemic change in these domains. And they're really trying to use these DAOs as a decentralized governance structure to be able to accomplish this. And that's part of the thesis, right? That we can use these DAO governance mechanisms to actually achieve things that we were not able to before in what some may call a broken system. So what are DAO structures good for, and where do they fail? I want to go into a little bit of examples on how these governance mechanisms are useful, but also sometimes hurtful for some of these projects. But first I want to define what is a DAO. This is my personal definition. I think we can see a wide range of definitions of what a DAO actually is across lots of different thought leaders in the space. So here I've defined it as a self-governing collective with a shared goal that uses an automated decision-making process. And I think for me, the key here is that it is a collective, a tool to be able to make collective decision-making and empower every member of that collective to be able to participate in that decision-making process. So some of the standard mechanisms that are used, governance tokens, obviously, these grant rights to the holders to make decisions in the DAO. They're generally used in a democratic voting process. And now we're starting to see emerging delegation mechanisms come up as well. All of this governance happens transparently on-chain, and there's a history of decisions that are made by the DAO. Oftentimes we see DAOs manage collective funds, and often we see the DAO having sole governance power over some or all of the protocol's parameters. So oftentimes when a project launches, they may be things that are set in stone, and then a DAO is able to govern certain parameters that can be changed, or maybe even potentially all of them. And so these are some of the standard mechanisms that we started to see pop up. And I think the key here is that they're really enabling open, transparent, collective decision-making. So that's really when these mechanisms are ideal, is when, here are a couple of examples from tally.xyz, this platform to be able to interact with these different DAOs. So you see here Gitcoin, and you have delegates here with different voting powers. And you also see on the right side Radical with a list of proposals that have been submitted. And these are two organizations that have basically have these goals that this is their, the most important thing for them is this transparency, is this ability to actually collectively make these decisions. And they're making this trade-off between streamlined, top-down decision-making that's much faster, much more efficient, obviously, but they're making this trade-off for the wisdom of the collective and having the collective actually actively participate in the decision-making process. So I think there are definitely areas where this makes sense, and these DAO governance mechanisms are really helpful. But obviously, if you want to make a really quick decision, if you have something that you need to get done and is like maybe a more short-term focus area, that's something that could be good for a traditional corporate structure. But these mechanisms are really focused on having this transparency, having this collective coordination, and so there are trade-offs that are made there. So just taking a look at some of the shortcomings, the coordination process is much slower, and the off-chain discussion processes are still emerging. So one thing that we see here is a lot of off-chain tools that are popping up. So something like what I showed you, Tally, there. This is a screen grab, I think, from a discourse forum. And we're iterating, I think, as a collective on how we can improve this coordination overhead. I think this off-chain tooling is actually something that's incredibly important, especially if you've been in the Ethereum ecosystem for a while. It has only been off-chain governance coordination, and that's quite difficult. So having the on-chain component definitely does make things a little bit more streamlined and transparent and clear, and then also iterating on these off-chain tools that we have to be able to use these DAOs effectively is definitely going to make a huge difference. Another huge issue that people have with DAO governance is the fact that financial weight is deciding all of these decisions. So contributors that have non-monetary ways of contributing to the DAO are not fairly represented in the decision making because it's all coin holder voting, and oftentimes these coins are just acquired by purchasing these tokens. And this also brings up the potential for attacks. So the screen grab here is actually from a post from Vitalik on someone offering to buy votes. And this is something that actually comes up as a pretty terrible attack for a lot of projects where there is a very liquid token supply and you can actually just go on a market, acquire tokens, and swing a vote without any consequences. So having mechanisms in our DAO governance that actually prevent something like this, so for example, having time-locked voting definitely helps something like this, but also being able to have a way to participate in the governance process that's not solely tied to just having the tokens. And one way that people are thinking of addressing this is, for example, awarding NFTs to contributors, or something like soul-bound NFTs to be able to represent contributors in the system that are non-monetary contributors. And I think another huge issue that we see in DAO governance still today, but also governance globally in any kind of way, is just low participation rates. And this also begs the question of what level of participation is even ideal. I think this probably varies from DAO to DAO, and so I think a larger research effort, this is something that a lot of organizations globally are trying to focus on, and getting more participation in democracy, but also the right kind of participation, someone who's actually actively interested in the outcome of that vote and not just voting for the sake of it. So not just incentivizing participation by itself and like giving a token reward to vote, but rather finding ways that we can actually improve meaningful participation. So I think we're not quite there yet. We do have a lot of research areas to focus on, but I want to take a look at some of these different domains, some of these different projects, and how their approach really has a thread that ties them together, and how they see using DAOs and why it's meaningful to them. So first I'm going to start off with my project Centrifuge. So Centrifuge is, I would say, financial infrastructure, or rather credit infrastructure, for people to borrow and lend money transparently and cost effectively. So the vision of our DAO is to govern the protocol parameters, and the on-chain treasury with the goal, the lofty goal to make finance fair, and specifically by getting money to those who need it in the fastest and cheapest way. So we do that by financing real-world assets with securitization pools on Centrifuge. And the whole point of using a DAO for us is that belief that we think transparent and collective aspects of this DAO decision-making are what are needed to really rebuild our financial system. So those are really, I think, the key elements there of the transparency, and something that we found, and I think many of us can agree, is lacking in our financial system today, and having that collective wisdom actually participate in the process as well. One of the governance mechanisms that we've been really focused on lately, and also on improving lately, is the delegation process. Sorry. So delegates, I think, allow for empowered decision-making. They enable experts in different contexts, while also addressing some of this voter fatigue in participation. And this mechanism of delegation somewhat addresses this issue as well of whale-led decision-making, because you don't actually have to own any tokens yourself to be able to run as a delegate. But this delegation system still has a lot of elements to be worked out. So going back here to this voting power for Gitcoin, you can see that it tends to all sort of aggregate towards a few people to have this delegation voting power, which can be good if they're actually interested in being a delegate and interested in being that expert. But sometimes these people are just like thought leaders in the space, and people delegate to them, and they actually have no interest in being a delegate. And so we've seen that come up in a few different cases, and I think that's something that we definitely need to improve, is this coordination process off-chain about what is the process to actually run as a delegate, what is sort of the responsibilities that you have as a delegate, and can there be agreements made in that delegation process between both the token holders as well as the delegate themselves. For example, the DAO actually paying them a salary to be able to do due diligence over every single vote that they actually focus on. So that's something that a lot of different projects are exploring, and I think will make for much better informed voting as well. So going into another project in DeFi, the AAVE DAO. So the objective of the AAVE DAO is to manage the parameters of the protocol and govern the treasury to distribute grants for the benefit of the AAVE ecosystem. So basically very similar to Centrifuge, right? DeFi really has this thread in it of trying to empower financial infrastructure as public goods. And their thesis is that this should be the case. And they're using the AAVE DAO framework as the most conducive structure to achieve this. So within DeFi, you can definitely see this thread that we want this financial infrastructure to be public goods, and the best way to actually govern that is through DAO governance mechanisms. So what about other domains? I think it's maybe pretty apparent in DeFi that DAOs are pretty ubiquitous and used quite often. But open source code collaboration, using the example of Radical, also very similar thesis and very similar goal. They want to become a community-owned and operated, self-sustaining open source network for software collaboration. And their core thesis is that these projects are already functioning as DAOs, and their mission is just to redesign the relationship that they have with money and their ability to coordinate and make decisions as a collective in a much more efficient, streamlined process. They're also researching this point that I mentioned earlier about empowering non-financial weight in decision-making through the use of NFTs. So if you're interested to learn more about this, Abby Titcomb from Radical is actually going to give a workshop this week about exploring how to use that within the governance process, and so I think that could be really interesting to take a look at as well. But there are definitely some tweaks to be worked out in something like that, like how do you actually measure the weight of what this collaboration should be compared to tokens and a percentage of the token supply if they're both used in the same governance process, Or maybe you have different cabinets in like a House and a Senate, and you have token holders voting in one side and NFT holders voting in another, or experts voting in another. So I think there's a lot of questions still and how this could be worked out, but I think it's definitely a very important effort that we actually find ways to empower non-financial weight within our governance process. So now I'm going to jump to one final domain, and that's DeSci, or decentralized science. So Vita DAO, this DAO to fund longevity research, their thesis is that the business model approach of biopharma research carries severe limitations. So basically, they believe that R&D inefficiencies are costing those that should really be the core stakeholders the most, the patients and the researchers. So they believe that this open cooperative structure will remove these inefficiencies by enabling an active community of contributors through a circular system that appropriately aligns incentives. So I think that's the key here, is that, so they have this governance token, Vita. It's acquired by contributing funds, but it's also acquired by contributing work, research data, or IP assets. So I think that's a unique way of addressing this issue of financial weight carrying all of the power. And so I think having that circular system of really incentivizing participation in order to get ownership and decision-making power within your DAO is really important. So I think we continue to see these threads really between all of these different domains about how they look to DAOs to really create change in each of these different systems, and how they believe this collective decision-making model, this transparent decision-making model, is what's really key in being able to accomplish that. So I think despite the thesis of these groups and these DAO mechanisms having a lot of research and exploration today, they're still novel, they're still being tested against issues that arise in governance. And so I think there are a lot of really interesting organizations out there today that are researching, that are funded to research also how and if DAOs are able to really solve these specific issues in governance. So organizations like SCRF, SCRF, and Block Science, Commons Fund is actually set up like a DAO to be able to really explore how these DAOs are used, how these governance mechanisms work. And I think it's really interesting even to look at these research organizations and how they're set up. Commons Fund is an example of a research organization set up as a DAO, and something like Block Science set up as a traditional corporation. And they do have different goals. Commons Fund is really looking for finding a minimum viable pattern, something that can really work for the general industry trying to use DAOs. And Block Science is trying to iterate on new innovative mechanisms and move quickly. And so I think it's really interesting to see, even within the DAO research space, that there are different ways to organize in these organizations. So yeah, I think if you're interested in looking at any DAO research, I would definitely look into one of these organizations. I think they're doing some really interesting work, and definitely worth checking out if that's something that you're focused on. Yeah, so thank you for attending this talk, listening to me talk about DAO governance. I wasn't really able to deep dive into anything in particular, but I really just wanted to paint this picture of what DAO governance mechanisms are useful for, and why these projects really have this belief and thesis in this space of why they use DAOs to create this change in these systems. So if you're a member of a DAO, I encourage you to collaborate with other DAOs like us, and with the research organizations that I mentioned, so that we can all innovate on these mechanisms. And I think talking about coordination and coordination overhead, we can definitely do that a lot better together, sharing our learnings, because I feel like sometimes I'm in a silo. So if you have any ideas about how to do that better, definitely come talk to me. But yeah, thank you guys.
Are there any questions? Yep.
Thank you. Going back to DAO delegation, do you believe that one day delegating will be a profession where you have teams of, what have you, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 people just following Centrifuge, 3 or 5 people focusing on AAVE, etc., but they all come from the same delegation house, so to speak. Do you think that's a possibility? How do you see delegation growing in the next 5 to 10 years, if possible?
Yeah, I think there are definitely going to be organizations that pop up that are focused on specific domains, and that means that they're probably participating in several different DAOs. So, for example, like a credit risk group within the Centrifuge ecosystem, they'd be working with Centrifuge on assessing the credit risk of different assets on our platform, but they'd be able to do that for any DAO, right? So it's kind of like they could be set up as a traditional business model if they want to. And they can have a traditional corporate structure where they're just going to these DAOs looking for a salary as delegates to be the ones that are providing this service to that ecosystem. So I think it's not completely overhauling the way that we work as a society, but more so making it transparent, making it more open, and being able to have that collective aspect of it, that anyone could come into that system and be able to participate as well.
Thank you, Cassidy. That was really interesting. I have a comment and a question. So my comment is just that I really agree with a lot of the things that you said, the potential of DAOs, but also the drawbacks. And I think it's really related to the actual definition of the DAO, right? So the decentralized part. So how inclusive can we actually make it? And what is the participation rate in that? And then obviously the autonomous part, which is the decision-making is automated. That's the goal, transparent, automated decision-making. But then what happens to all the off-chain conversations? And I think, that's the core of what it is. And I'm really glad that, you said it so plainly. My question is around, it's a similar question around the delegated voting, because what we're seeing now are folks with, hundreds of jobs, or they're not exactly in a position where they need to work and they're volunteering. But it seems like you're saying that this doesn't actually create room for others who might want to become delegates and actually do this sustainably and have enough resources to adequately research. So I'm wondering if you've seen any models of how that might work, how that maybe future of work or future of payment might work. Thank you.
I know one model that's imperfect, but always on the leading edge of a lot of this DAO work, and that's MakerDAO. And there are some issues with having this incentivized process of delegates because it can end up becoming too political. But I think they're going in the right direction, which is actually giving people the resources that they need to full-time focus on a topic. So I think we're going to end up seeing that sort of evolve over time, where you don't necessarily have to be a politician in order to be able to run as a delegate, but you do have to do some amount of work. For example, if you're an organization, it probably makes more sense that you have 3 or 5 people. One of them is maybe more of the politician, but you actually have a team behind you of people doing research, people doing work to actually make thoughtful, informed decisions for this DAO. And they would then, as running as a delegate, ask for a grant from the DAO. I want to be a full-time delegate. This is the grant that I'm looking for to be able to accomplish that work. And it would probably vary from domain. Like something like credit risk might be more expensive than something that's a little bit more, I don't know, like marketing work, for example. Also really important for DAOs that they actually get noticed in the ecosystem. So I think there's a lot of different areas where we can see this pop up, and maybe it moves more towards an organization aspect of having delegates so that you can actually have, not super politician focused, but also really informed and compensated for that work as well.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit more about specifically the case of Centrifuge, the company, versus Centrifuge, the DAO? What is the relationship between the two today, the roles and responsibilities, and what is the ambition to let that evolve in the future?
Yeah, so we're still, I would say, pretty centralized in the sense of the company is definitely the largest part of the DAO right now. But we do have a DAO in terms of having tokens that are relatively widely distributed, although still centralized in the company more so. And we have 12 different asset pools that are live on Centrifuge. Each of those pools is run by what we call an asset originator. And all of them have tokens, ownership in this DAO, decision-making power. We've just launched a process to actually be able to open the next pools on Centrifuge. So far it has definitely been a lot of hand-holding, a lot by Anna, who's sitting there, for the asset originators to walk them through this process, get them actually to a point where they can launch on Centrifuge. And hopefully we're creating enough documentation, enough of a standard process that they can do this all on our forum by themselves. And they can just get the community to actually vote on this. First on the forum, this off-chain mechanism, then being able to take that on-chain once it gets to that certain point of the process that they can actually open this pool. And Centrifuge, the company, doesn't have to be involved in that at all. So today's still a little bit more hand-holding, definitely, but we've launched that process and it is moving in the right direction. So I'm definitely excited to see more participation, and I think having this delegation mechanism is something that we're looking at quite closely to be able to facilitate that.
So right now it seems like all these DAO structures are very kind of closely tied to like financial aspects of things, especially with kind of like the fact that there's like tokens and things like this. Do you foresee a world where things kind of like central governments could move towards like DAO structures, and like would there be any kind of like benefits to that kind of thing? 'Cause it's like the way that like central governments usually kind of have things where it's like not in relation to like how much money someone makes is kind of, or like how much money they have is like their voting power sort of, it's like just different. But do you see kind of like benefits or kind of like a world where more traditional kind of like companies or governments or something like that could kind of like utilize DAOs?
I think for a company, it really depends on what their focus is. Like again, if they want to move fast and they want to iterate, maybe that top-down hierarchy, still having information asymmetry, mostly because of the work of spreading the information, really, in companies, could still work for some of those use cases. For a government, I think it could be useful to move in this direction. I don't know if we're going to see it anytime soon for federal governments, just because of the long-standing systems there and people who benefit from them. But I do think we could start seeing it on community level, and maybe even like working up towards county or states in different countries that are employing this. Because I think, I mean, just going back to like what a DAO is, maybe just taking the part of self-governing collective, I think that applies to a country. It applies to a state. And then there's the element of the DAO that's this automated decision-making process. And I think this can be quite clunky to actually implement from the beginning. But once people get used to it, I mean, people learn quite quickly. So I think it's more about getting people used to a structure like this. And so starting off on the community level is something I could easily see happening. And I think it's already starting to happen in co-ops and other like collectives that are popping up around the world. And so hopefully that starts to evolve towards, yeah, more federal governments too.
Any other questions?
Cool. Thanks for all the questions. Thank you, everyone.